This is Elena Wagner on April 5th, 2011, with a master's student at UC Berkeley who was working through the financial crisis. And I'm going to ask her some of her opinions about the Occupy movement. So, when did you first hear about Occupy?
I think the New York Times, online. I guess there was some articles posted, and then also Facebook as well, because Occupy Wall Street was, based in Manhattan, which is where a lot of my friends live.
And were you living in Manhattan at the time?
No, I was already attending grad school here on the West Coast at Berkeley.
And what was your first impression?
Apathy. I guess at the same time there was a lot of parodies about 1% versus 99%, and a lot of sort of extraneous, unrelated jokes being made about which group people belong to. I understand the sentiment, and I also kind of observed a sort of ambivalence within myself as a result of having worked during the financial crisis, because that was sort of a precursor leading up to the Occupy movement.
And what do you think of the 1%, 99% rhetoric of the Occupy movement? Do you think that's representative of how income inequality is distributed in America? Or do you think that's an effective way to get people involved?
So I think I understand people are angry. I understand that completely. And I grew up in Washington, D.C. As a teenager, and very much was faced with the sort of, gross income disparity and poverty that persists for generations, and people's inability to come out of it despite policy changes to try to help them. And I think that by assigning blame to Wall Street as an entity by the public and the mobs that eventually were involved, from what I understand of the movement, that it's a fallacy in itself, because as a lot of documentaries like The Inside Job explains, it is not the fault of a single organization. And my personal perspective through the financial crisis, and having been around companies and friends who've, been affected because their companies went under, or business wasn't doing good, and the entire city was mired in what seemed like the apocalypse, that I think the anger was misassigned to something that people didn't fully understand, and the media exploited that and sensationalized it in such a way that just inflamed the sort of mob mentality that came to become what we know as Occupy.
So where do you think the blame really lies?
I think the blame, first of all, I would move away from blame. I think that the financial crisis, if that is what Occupy was protesting against, was an amalgamation of a lot of institutional and also sort of a critical mass that came together as a result of, a chain of events that can't really be pinpointed to a single organization entity. There were a lot of parties involved and a lot of people involved, from the average U.S. household to, even the Fed Reserve, and decisions that were made way up above. So for people to blame bankers because it's easy is just a little misinformed, and I think that by occupying it, because growing up and living in America in a very peaceful time for most of my life, I have not been affronted with these sorts of protests that maybe other countries might be more familiar with. So I think it's an interesting outcome, because it was not really politically motivated. It was more that people felt that there was an injustice because their financial circumstances were not in the best straits, and a lot of people, I understand, suffered all over America in all types of industries who were not able to actually physically participate. Although I don't know for sure, maybe they did travel great distances to come to places like Oakland and New York City and other parts of the country where the movement was happening at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of involvement and like action that happened here on the Berkeley campus and in Oakland. Did you see this, and what made you decide not to get involved?
On the night of your house party, I saw people occupy the front of my dorm where I'm currently staying, and that was both interesting and also ridiculous at the same time, because there was a SWAT team outside the dorm asking people to identify themselves, because people chose to march up Bancroft and come all the way up to the hill and pitch tents in the front of the building. And I think they continued to do so for about 24 hours. I didn't feel threatened or anything, because I think I assumed that the protesters were a peaceful bunch and were not going to set the house on fire or do anything violent, which I heard is not the case back on Occupy Wall Street. And I did actually solicit some opinions from friends who went through that, and people generally seem very blasé and apathetic as well. So
Your friends who are bankers?
not bankers, just regular people who lived in the city.
In New York?
Yes. I asked if their daily lives were interrupted by the Occupy movement. And they said,
And
yeah, here and there, like, they saw people protesting and marching. They're aware of it. But I also know people here who became extremely actively involved, and friends of friends who supposedly got arrested for protesting down in Oakland. So I think here has got a more, maybe because of Berkeley's and East Bay's like political history, people were probably a little more protesty. I think maybe on the East Coast they're really, I feel like when people do protest on the East Coast, there's this sentimentality. They're kind of doing it for themselves, but as a group, as opposed to for a higher ideal or sort of an institutional change. So,
interesting. Is there anything else that you want to add?
I agree with, I guess, the basis of the movement, that the disparity between the rich and the poor is just obscene and absurd. And I suppose that since by saying that this is not the correct venue for which these messages can be conveyed, I'm also not offering an alternative for how they could actually be conveyed to affect some kind of change for those who are suffering. So in that sense, that makes me sort of a bad person, because I'm not really looking out for the people who are suffering, because my own circumstances so far have been pretty benign. They're not terrible. But I think had I been affronted with some of the economic fallouts of the financial crisis itself, I would feel much more strongly and probably would have a stronger stance on this, as opposed to just feeling rather neutral about it, because I don't feel personally affected. So I do extend my sympathies to people for that reason, but I think that's also the reason that inflamed them to kind of seek a course of protest that may not be that effective. So
Great. Well, thank you so much for
Yeah,
spending
no
the
problem.
time to talk to me.
yeah.